The Young and the Restless spoilers. When the truth finally began to surface, it didn't come as a loud revelation but rather as a slow, suffocating tide closing around Holden Novak. What had begun as a night of secrets in Los Angeles had spiraled into something far darker, connecting him to a web of criminal dealings that no one in Genoa City could have imagined. The police had been watching quietly, collecting fragments of information, and when Noah's accident was finally linked to Holden's criminal network, the facade of control he'd maintained began to crack. The investigation unearthed traces of illegal transactions, falsified logistics records, and names of known associates in underground operations that stretched from Los Angeles to Genoa City. But what shocked everyone most was that Holden, calm, professional, outwardly devoted, was at the center of it all. The reports claimed that his connections had indirectly caused the chain of events leading to Noah's near-fatal crash. When detectives confronted him, Holden didn't resist. He sat in silence, his expression unreadable, the weight of guilt pressing into every line on his face. Then, without a lawyer's prompting, he said something no one expected. He took full responsibility. He confessed, not just for the business violations or the money laundering, but for the crash itself, insisting that he alone bore the blame. The officers looked at each other, uncertain whether they were witnessing remorse or manipulation. To them, it didn't make sense. Why would a man so calculated suddenly decide to destroy himself? But Holden's reasoning ran deeper than law or logic. It was personal. Perhaps it was guilt over Claire. Perhaps it was anger at Matt Clark's resurgence. Perhaps it was his last desperate attempt to control a narrative that was already collapsing around him. Nick and Sharon were relentless when they found out. They visited him, pressing for answers, demanding names, demanding truth. They wanted to know who else was involved, who had set this up, who had manipulated Noah's fate. Holden hesitated, torn between fear and defiance. For days, he refused to speak, even as the evidence piled higher. But one evening, something broke. When Nick accused him of cowardice, when Sharon whispered that Noah deserved justice, Holden's mask finally cracked. He whispered a single name, Matt Clark. The revelation sent shockwaves through everyone who heard it. Matt, the man long thought dead or gone, had been alive, operating under aliases, and now deeply embedded in Sienna Bacall's growing empire. He had built a network so intricate that Holden, despite his own complicity, had become just another piece on Matt's board. Holden explained everything in fragments. Matt was the true architect, the one who'd used Holden's company as a front to move illegal shipments. When Noah began to suspect something and got too close, Matt orchestrated the crash that nearly killed him. Holden had tried to cover the tracks, terrified of what Matt would do if he didn't. By the time the truth came out, the damage was irreversible. Every piece of digital evidence had been wiped clean, every transaction rerouted through untraceable accounts. He deleted everything, Holden said quietly. If you want to catch him, you'll have to find what he didn't expect us to see. The irony was merciless. Holden had spent months trying to protect Claire and keep his distance from Audra's chaos, only to end up trapped in something infinitely worse. His decision to take the blame wasn't heroism, it was exhaustion. He had spent too long pretending to be a savior, too long justifying sins as survival. When he saw Sienna Bacall, Emmett, and Claire laughing together outside a restaurant days before his arrest, something in him snapped. To Holden, that image was unbearable, a picture of happiness he no longer belonged to, a reminder that he had lost everything worth saving. His rage had driven him back toward recklessness, and it was that very impulse that led him to confess, to burn down the last bridge connecting him to them. Now, the police demanded evidence against Matt Clark, but Holden had nothing concrete to give, only memories, threats, and whispers. Matt had erased his trail with surgical precision, leaving Holden as the visible target. Sienna's influence in Los Angeles made her nearly untouchable, and even if Holden's confession implicated her by association, she had the wealth and power to redirect attention elsewhere. Still, his words planted seeds of suspicion. Detectives began to quietly re-examine the connections between Sienna's companies and the criminal shell organizations under Matt's control. As Holden awaited trial, Genoa City's streets buzzed with speculation. Some called him a liar, others a scapegoat. Claire visited once, standing silently across the glass partition, her eyes filled with the kind of pain that words couldn't reach. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain that his confession was as much for her as for himself, that taking the fall meant sparing her from Matt's retaliation. But he said nothing. The truth, he believed, would only destroy her more. Outside, the media painted him as the villain, the man behind Noah's suffering. Yet somewhere beneath the headlines, whispers began to spread that the real monster was still free. In private, Sharon told Nick that Holden's confession didn't add up. He might have participated, yes, but there was no proof he'd planned Noah's crash. Nick agreed, but without evidence, their suspicions meant nothing. They began to dig quietly, revisiting every person tied to the Los Angeles operation, every name Holden had mentioned. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became. Matt Clark had built a ghost network, one designed to survive even after every accomplice fell. It was as if he anticipated betrayal at every level and had prepared for it long before anyone suspected. The tragedy of Holden Novak wasn't just in what he did, it was in what he became. A man who once believed he could fix chaos by absorbing it. A man who mistook silence for strength and confession for redemption. His downfall became a mirror for everyone around him, for Audra, who used manipulation to mask vulnerability, for Claire, who trusted too easily, for Sienna, who blurred morality in pursuit of dominance. Holden's punishment wasn't merely imprisonment, it was knowing that the truth he'd revealed would outlive him, twisting through Genoa City like smoke, seeding new wars in its wake. And yet, beneath all the wreckage, a single thread of uncertainty remained. Matt Clark was gone, vanished before authorities could act. Sienna Bacall, calm and unbothered, denied everything. But deep down, everyone knew this wasn't the end. Holden's confession was only the opening act of a much larger reckoning. Somewhere out there, Matt was watching, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The evidence may have been erased, but secrets have a way of surviving. And so the question lingered, burning through every conversation, every sleepless night. If Holden Novak was willing to sacrifice everything to shield the truth, what kind of truth was terrible enough to make a guilty man want to burn alone? The shock of Holden Novak's confession spread through Genoa City like a storm no one could contain. When the police heard his words, his calm admission that he was responsible for Noah's accident, there was a stunned silence, the kind that fills the air before something breaks. Nick and Sharon were in the room when it happened, watching the man who had once been part of their lives fall apart in front of them. At first, they thought it was guilt, or fear, or some desperate attempt at redemption. But as Holden continued to speak, his voice cracking, his eyes vacant, they realized that something was off. His words felt rehearsed, detached, like he was reading from a script written by someone else. The more he insisted that he was the only one to blame, the less it sounded like truth and more like sacrifice. Still, procedure demanded evidence, and the police moved fast. Holden was handcuffed, processed, and thrown into a cell as headlines screamed his name. Within hours, the public was convinced he was the man behind the wheel, the criminal mastermind, the reason Noah Newman had nearly died. Case closed. Justice served. But Nick couldn't breathe under that narrative. He'd seen Holden's eyes, the flicker of panic hidden behind false composure, and he knew that this story didn't fit. Sharon agreed. Holden wasn't innocent, but he wasn't the monster they were painting him to be. Somewhere, someone else was still pulling the strings. That someone was Matt Clark. While Holden sat in a cold cell, Matt was walking free, smiling, laughing, savoring his victory. He appeared at social gatherings beside Sienna Bacall, every inch the charming businessman, his demeanor smugly untouchable. He had orchestrated the entire collapse with surgical precision, ensuring that when the house of cards fell, Holden would be standing alone in the debris. Now, as the city whispered about Holden's downfall, Matt basked in his freedom, confident that his tracks were gone. His associates had been silenced, his data erased, and his empire rebranded under Sienna's corporate fronts. To the world, Matt was a rehabilitated investor, not a criminal. Inside his cell, Holden's mind unraveled. Days of confinement blurred into each other, echoes of reporters, the smell of sweat and steel, the sound of his name muttered like a curse outside his door. He tried to tell himself that he had done the right thing, that protecting others from Matt was worth his own ruin. But when news of Matt's arrogance reached him, when he heard that Matt had been seen celebrating his arrest, drinking champagne as if toasting a conquest, something in Holden snapped. He realized that by taking the blame, he hadn't protected anyone. He had only made Matt stronger. Determined to fight back, Holden demanded a lawyer. He refused the public defender assigned to him and instead sought one with power, someone who could reopen the investigation and trace Matt's hidden operations. His desperation was no longer for redemption but for revenge. Every moment he spent in that cell hardened him, turning regret into resolve. He began writing down everything he remembered of names, dates, coded messages, accounts Matt had once mentioned in passing. He didn't know which details mattered, but he knew that somewhere in those fragments lay the thread that could pull Matt down. Nick watched the news with clenched fists, unable to accept that justice had been done. He and Sharon began meeting privately, piecing together their own theory. Sharon reminded him that Holden had mentioned Matt before, during that final breakdown before his arrest. Nick contacted an old ally in law enforcement and requested access to the investigation files. There, buried beneath stacks of reports, he found small inconsistencies, times that didn't match, surveillance footage that mysteriously disappeared, financial records rewritten within hours of being uploaded. Each anomaly led back to one point of origin, Los Angeles, the same place where Sienna Bakal's companies were based. The realization hit like a cold wave. Matt Clark had erased his name from the digital world, but his shadow remained in the cracks. Nick knew this was his chance, not just to save Holden but to expose the monster behind him. He approached the police captain, arguing that Holden's confession didn't align with the physical evidence at Noah's crash site. Sharon brought Noah's medical report, showing that the impact pattern suggested deliberate interference in the car's systems, something beyond Holden's capability. Together, they built a quiet case, one piece at a time, trying to reopen the door that everyone else had already closed. Meanwhile, Matt grew bolder. He taunted Holden indirectly, sending anonymous donations to charities in Holden's name, leaking exclusive tips to tabloids about his supposed guilt, twisting the knife deeper. Each gesture was a reminder of power, of control. But arrogance breeds mistakes. In his overconfidence, Matt began moving money again, shifting assets to prepare for his next venture. It was a subtle pattern, invisible to most, but not to Nick. With Sharon's help, he tracked the transactions through shell companies, finding one link that Matt had overlooked, a forgotten offshore account tied to an alias that had once belonged to Holden himself. It was the break they needed. Nick contacted Holden through his lawyer, urging him to stay quiet but hopeful. Together, they crafted a new plan, one that could expose Matt completely. Holden's testimony, combined with the digital trail, might be enough to convince the police to reopen the case. But there was risk. Matt had eyes everywhere, and if he sensed that Holden was fighting back, he'd destroy whatever evidence remained. As the days passed, tension in Genoa City grew unbearable. Reporters questioned the fairness of Holden's trial, the police faced public scrutiny, and whispers began to circle around Sienna Bakal's growing influence. Sharon urged patience, but Nick was done waiting. He wanted to see Matt in handcuffs, wanted to look him in the eyes and strip away that smug facade. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Late one evening, detectives raided a warehouse outside Los Angeles based on Holden's notes. Inside, they found encrypted drives, fake invoices, and correspondence signed not by Holden, but by Matt Clark. The discovery didn't exonerate Holden immediately, but it cracked the illusion Matt had built. For the first time, his empire trembled. When news reached the cell, Holden smiled for the first time in weeks. It wasn't over, not yet, but it was a beginning. Nick and Sharon continued their pursuit, determined to bring every accomplice down. Sienna's lawyers scrambled, Matt vanished from the public eye, and whispers of a federal investigation filled the air. The case that was supposed to be closed had been reborn, fiercer and more dangerous than ever. And so the question now haunting Genoa City was not whether Holden Novak was guilty, but whether truth could ever truly destroy a man like Matt Clark. Could Nick and Sharon's pursuit finally bring him to justice? Or would he vanish again, leaving behind only ghosts, broken lives, and the chilling certainty that monsters don't hide under the bed, they walk among them, smiling, free, and untouchable?